Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So I've done two videos today about the ongoing conflict, and I felt prudent that I needed to do a third today. And today I want to talk about the future, while at the same time looking at the present. Now, if you listen to the mainstream media, whether it's Fox News, CNN, what have you, CBS, NBC, the conflict appears to be stagnant. We continue to hear about this ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive here in the south, but the reality is that counteroffensive has failed. And the Russians have fixed the Ukrainian military in this banana-shaped front. Remember, the Russians were able to withdraw a lot of forces from the western bank of Kherson. They were able to withdraw forces from Kharkov, and then condense those forces along this front line. So those Russian forces that just several months ago were having to garrison and defend this area here, the western bank of the Dnieper River, a lot of those forces have since fallen back across the Dnieper River and are now primarily focused with the defensive belt, the multiple defensive belts that exist running from Zaporizhzhia all the way to the north towards Kupiansk. We think at this point, just in terms of the Russian force construct, and I am including ground forces, I am including coastal defense and naval infantry, I am including elements of the Russian National Guard, Russian airborne forces, Russian GRU, and Spetsnaz forces. That force construct running from Belarus, protecting existing Russian borders, and then all the way down to the south towards within the direction of Kherson, there's probably about 700,000 Russian forces, with about 400,000 of those Russian forces committed to the actual line of contact where hostilities are taking place. Now, we also know that the Russian military, specifically the Russian ground forces, is expanding by about 20 to 35,000 personnel per month. Per month, 25 to 35,000. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on said month. At a certain point in the not too distant future, and you also have to look at what's more important, is that per month total expanding. You know, in 4 months from now, we could see the Russian military expanding by 40,000, 50,000 per month. And eventually, you're going to see anywhere from 1 to 1.5 million Russian troops, both committed to the ongoing operation against the Ukrainians and protecting existing Russian borders and Belarusian borders. And that's going to continue to expand. Now, while this expansion is happening within the Russian ground forces, remember, the Ukrainian military is fixed. Every day, the Ukrainian military is subjected to strikes from fixed-wing aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, attack helicopters, attacking this line of contact, while at the same time, the Russians are hitting rear areas. So, for instance, if a Ukrainian unit, a new Ukrainian unit, moves across the Dnieper River and quarters itself, garrisons itself someplace in downtown Zaporizhia, a battalion-sized unit garrisons itself someplace in Zaporizhia. And they're having to do this because the Ukrainians, they cannot go to existing military bases. Those existing military bases have been destroyed. The buildings have been hit by Iskanders or other KH-101 cruise missiles, and they're gone. So the Ukrainians have to house their forces, either rotating back from the front lines or towards the front lines, waiting to be deployed in these Ukrainian cities. Well, the Russians are watching this. The Russians have intelligence on the ground, and then they have, obviously, remote sensing assets in space as well. So they're able to watch these Ukrainian units move into place, take over a building, and then very, very soon, once that Ukrainian unit moves into said building or what have you, the Russians are able to launch a cruise missile strike, or in a lot of cases, a ballistic missile, semi-ballistic missile, as fired from the Iskander, or the dagger, the Kinzhal, against these areas where the Ukrainian units are staging. Those strikes that are absolutely not reported by the Ukrainian state have resulted in the deaths of thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian service members. So now they're starting to really disperse in platoon and company-sized elements all over the place when they try to move these units towards the front. Do the Ukrainians have that capability? Do they have the deep strike capability of hitting targets deep inside of Russia with long-range missiles that are being targeted by satellite capability? No, they don't. That's why the Ukrainians want the ATACMS. They want to have that capability, that deep strike capability. The United States right now is saying, we're not going to do that just yet. Now, is it possible to happen in the near term or in the future? Yeah, it is. It's possible. I think eventually the ATACMS will find its way to Ukraine and possibly other systems as well. Now, as this conflict continues, we're going to reach a point where the casualties that the Ukrainian military has taken is eventually going to cause the collapse of said military, of the Ukrainian military. Remember, the strikes continue while at the same time the Russian military is continuing its buildup in this area. And at a certain point, again, in the not too distant future, when that is, it's difficult to say. Is it a year from now? Is it 6 months from now? Is it 2 years from now? Is it 3 years from now? Is it 4 years from now? Hard to say. I know I'll get a lot of pushback on pushing it out to 4 years, but I wouldn't rule that out. But once the Russians start these massive general offenses, and I'm talking about using 150, 200,000, 250,000 troops allocated to a sector of the conflict. Like right now, we're seeing the Russians deploy 100, 150,000 to the east of Kupiansk. And we anticipate a very large offensive operation by the Russians in this area, near Kupiansk. We haven't seen it yet. We're seeing the early stages of what could be a fairly large Russian offensive operation in this locale. But an all-out general move by the Russian military en masse, we're not seeing it yet. And the Russians at this point appear to be completely okay with what's happening right now. Again, these fix and destroy operations. They see Ukrainian units moving into a certain area, and then they sense those units. They know where they're at, and then they strike those units with a variety of systems. Now, are the Ukrainians doing the same to the Russians? Are they using HIMARS and other systems to hit Russian targets? Yeah, they are. And again, it's a brutal conflict. But the Russians have more of these systems. Is the technology that the Ukrainians are using, is it ahead of the Russians in some cases? It is. The HIMARS is a very good system that is probably, I don't want to say probably, I believe they are. I believe they are beyond what the Russian military has at this point, at least in terms of the accuracy and the ability of the United States to sense Russian movement and then use those HIMARS to strike Russian targets. The Brimstone and Brimstone 2, incredibly advanced piece of missile technology that are being used by the Ukrainians. But again, it takes a vast infrastructure to build those missiles. They're very expensive, and the Ukrainians just don't possess that many of them. The Brits, who are handing over the Brimstone to the Ukrainians, are giving them Brimstones, but when compared to the sheer amount of missiles the Russians are using, it's a completely different story. Just in terms of quantity versus quality. The quantity that the Russians possess, even though the quality may not be as good in some categories. Okay, the Challenger 2 main battle tank. I would absolutely rather be in a Challenger 2 main battle tank than any Russian main battle tank that you currently see on the field. T-72, T-72 Bravo 3, T-80, T-80U, T-90, T-90M. Yeah. Would not want to be in those tanks and would much rather prefer to be in a Challenger 2. And the mainstream media narrative is the Ukrainians are getting the Challengers. But the Ukrainians only have a company-sized element of Challenger main battle tanks. That's it. 14. So, again, yes, the Challenger is a great tank. I believe much better than a T-90 or a T-80 as a former tanker. And the Ukrainians will be receiving the M1 Abrams. But again, a battalion size set. That's it. The Russians have thousands of tanks. You know, whether it's a tank that has been taken out of storage, maybe it's a T-62 with a 115 millimeter gun. That tank is then upgraded. They put a thermal imaging sight on it. That T-62, while not a great tank in terms of the modern era, it still has a capability. And the Russians are fielding hundreds of those systems. And not just that, you have T-72s, T-80s, T-90s, which are actively being produced at a much greater rate than what is being handed over to the Ukrainians. But then you factor in these other systems, attack helicopters, combat aircraft. It's just the size disparity in terms of quality and quantity is just overwhelming. And it's going to grow. And I believe at a certain point, we're going to hit this pivotal time where the Russians start these massive massive counteroffensives, these massive operations. And they may not be just confined to the banana. They may be looking to open up new fronts. Another front near Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod, even Belarus. You can't write that off. You can't discount that possibility. And then again, the amount of casualties that the Ukrainians are taking right now, and especially over the last few months, have just been appalling. Now, I don't agree with the... We've heard different numbers, and one number being thrown out there is the Ukrainians have lost 400,000 personnel. Now, I think that's a stretch. I really do. I don't believe that has happened. I know recently, what's the guy's name? Douglas McGregor, Colonel Douglas McGregor, former U.S. Army colonel, served in the first Gulf War. He was a battalion commander. He commanded a mechanized unit, armor, infantry. And he stated that he believes the Ukrainians have lost 400,000 troops. Now, has that happened? Have the Ukrainians lost that many personnel? I don't think so. I don't think it's that high. I think more likely than not, the Ukrainian military, at least in terms of KIA, has lost between, on the low end, 50 to 60,000 and quite possibly upwards to 100,000 personnel. The whole 400,000 seems incredibly high to me. And now, however, as I'd said in the previous video, I think over the course of the last 3 months, the Ukrainian casualty rate has skyrocketed. And that's for different reasons. The Russians are changing some of the targets they're hitting. Obviously, the biggest issue is the Ukrainians are trying to launch these counteroffensives. And it's not working. The Russians can see these offensive formations moving into staging areas. They can see exactly what they're doing. And then once the Ukrainians move, the Russians pound them. And you're seeing that. You're seeing that in Robatna, and you've seen it to also a great extent south of Staromayorsky. These two areas have become graveyards for the Ukrainian army. Just massive graveyards. And I have to wonder if the Russians are not allowing this salient to be created. You have to ask that question. Because, again, you've got a very narrow offensive line. Again, if we look at the width of it, it's 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers wide, and right now it's essentially, whoops, let me do this. In terms of deep, it's about 7.8 kilometers deep. So, to the west, to the east, to the south, Russian artillery is able to overlap and hit any target in this salient that the Ukrainians have put themselves in. Incredibly difficult situation for the Ukrainians. And again, no Air Force. So I just wanted to have a look at that. And again, more importantly, is what this is going to look like once Russia has decided it has the size of the force construct that the Russians have in the theater of operations is to the point where the Russians are comfortable in launching massive offensive operations. Again, not 20, 30, 40,000, 100, 150, 200,000 personnel. And while the Russians are waiting for that their forces to get to that point, remember, they are continuing to strike Ukrainian forces, both deep penetration strikes and pounding the Ukrainian military on the front line. So that's where we sit. We will have more analysis of the conflict. Thanks for joining us. And as always, have a good day.